Welcome to our launch event, Flexibility, the enabler of a clean energy transition. My name is Paul Wilczek. I'm heading the Distribution and Market Facilitation Unit at Eurelectric. And today we have over 700 registered participants to this event. So that's great. Thank you very much for your time and interest in this. Distribution grids move center stage in the debate on a successful energy transition. By 2030, about half of the entire generation fleet in Europe will be connected at distribution grid level. And together with massive amounts of electric heat pumps, we'll have charging stations for millions of electric vehicles, and we have increased electrification of industrial processes and uses. In our study earlier this year, Connecting the Dots, we showed already the investment needs for distribution grids in Europe by 2030. Now we need to focus on flexibility. The question to be answered is, how do we procure flexibility solutions in a market-based approach in Europe? I'm therefore really pleased that today we can present and discuss this report that we conceived by Eurelectric members experts from across the entire value chain at Eurelectric. I'll pass on now the word to Fergal McNamara from the Irish utility ESB, and Fergal is also the chair of the Distribution and Market Facilitation Committee at Eurelectric. Really pleased you can be here with us, Fergal, and moderate this event. So Fergal, please, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for that, Paul. Of course, I'm Fergal McNamara, and it's my great pleasure to be your moderator for this discussion on the important topic of flexibility, the enabler of the clean energy future. And our discussion this morning is organized into three parts. The first part is by Accenture, who will read us a report that they've conducted, which is benchmarking the use of flexibility by various DSOs across Europe. So looking forward to that. The second, Eurelectric will read us a report that they have prepared on the procurement of flexibility by the DSOs and the practical steps that are needed and the principles that should be adopted. And the third, we'll be joined by a panel for a discussion on the two reports and on the area of flexibility by the DSOs, by market service providers, by regulators and market participants. So we'll have a wide range of views across the industry and across the piece. I will introduce everybody as we go along, and I encourage you please to join us on this debate on social media using the hashtag flexibility and the hashtag electric decade. And so to start us off this morning, we have a presentation by Accenture, which is a practical benchmarking study of on-the-ground practices by the various DSOs. And I'm very pleased to welcome Gregorio Olaro and Gregory Yared, who will read this report to us now. Please, Accenture.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Fergal, for the introduction to the entire Eurelectric team for organizing this event. It's really a privilege for Accenture to be talking to this audience about the subject of flexibility. I believe that flexibility is starting to become a key topic in the utility industry, and I believe it will be for us for some times to come. For sure, flexibility for a DSO standpoint is a way to reduce the grid stress, to mitigate local congestion, and in general to enable grid stability. So today, my colleague Gregory Jerry is going to present a study, benchmark on local flexibility for DSO. We did this year together with Enedis, analyzing the flexibility maturity for more than 170 DSOs in Europe, representing 28 countries. So thank you for your attendance again, and over to you, Gregory.
Okay, thank you, Gregorio. Hello, everybody. Hope you are doing well. What we propose to do in the next 20 minutes is to have a look at the 4 key messages of our benchmark. So first, we will see that among the almost 200 DSOs that we've analyzed, we identified that flexibility is a very important topic for DSOs, and some of them are engaged in industrialized or semi-industrialized market approaches. Second, we will see that local flexibility can provide solutions both for planning and operation activities of the DSOs. Third, we will have a look on the different procurement processes that have been set up by DSOs, and we will deep dive a bit on short-term and long-term markets that have been set up. And last but not least, we will see that we are still at the beginning of this amazing journey, and there's still a lot of discussions going on regarding market rules and regulations. Okay, so we started with the whole list of unbundled DSOs. So we looked across EU 27 plus the UK at all the DSOs who have more than 100,000 customers. We looked for all the public information available, and we've seen that among those DSOs, 76 of them are actually testing flexibility solutions, which is already an interesting result. We are far from the very few demonstrators that were set up a couple of years ago under H2020 projects and so on. Now a lot of DSOs are looking at it. Among those DSOs, we've seen that 45 of them are testing market approaches. So you know that there are different ways to mobilize flexibilities. It could be through grid tariffs. It could be through variable connection agreements. It could be through rule-based mechanisms. And in this benchmark, we were focused on a market-based approach as per Article 32 of the last EU directive coming from the Clean Energy Package. So among all those DSOs, we decided to focus on 14 of them, which, according to our criteria, were the most advanced. So we looked at the maturity level of the solutions deployed. We looked at the voltage level that were considered. We looked at the different drivers for flexibility deployment and the level of transposition of the regulatory framework. So those DSOs, those 14 DSOs that we've considered, are localized in 5 countries: the UK, France, Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden. Taking into account that for Germany, there are several DSOs that have been quite advanced in market-based approach, but those solutions are currently stopped due to new regulations. Okay, now, so if we look at the list of DSOs, here you have the list of the DSOs that we've decided to analyze in details. One important thing is that they can be clustered within 2 groups having similar approaches. So we try to understand what are the drivers for the DSOs. And we've seen that for French and British DSOs, they are proactively looking for DSOs to solve congestions, to solve difficulties on their own grid, low, medium voltage. While for the other countries, in Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden, the main driver is to solve a congestion which is due to a lack of transmission capacity, so on the upstream grid, which causes a need for flexibility at distribution level. So this is typically the case for a situation that everybody knows well, which is in Germany with a very high level of penetration of renewable on the transmission level, which creates some congestions on the regional grids and quite a lot of redispatching cost. We have similar topics going on in the Netherlands and also in Sweden. Okay, now if we deep dive a bit on the services that are provided by local flexibilities for DSOs. We've learned that flexibilities are used both for planning and operation activities. So we've identified 5 use cases, 2 for grid planning and 3 for grid operations. Regarding grid planning, flexibility can be used for investment deferral, meaning that flexibility is compared to investment alternatives, reinforcement of the grid typically, And if they are seen as a technically feasible and economically interesting solution, the DSO would use flexibility in its planning approach, would consider that flexibility could bring in services. So that's the first use case, which is done in France and in the UK. So this is typically done in the planning process, up to 5 years in advance. Second grid planning use case is what we call permanent embedded solutions. So it follows the same approach. However, in this case, flexibility is seen as a solution to connect more capacity than what the equipment would allow. And the flexibility would remain and would be a permanent solution. While in the investment deferral use case, flexibility is here mainly to postpone an investment. Okay, and this is the second use case for grid planning is done mainly in France, with an interesting cooperation between DSO and TSOs. Okay, now looking at grid operations, flexibility can be used for a temporary need to relieve constraints on the network. And in terms of timelines, we are much closer to real time, most of the time, several days or weeks in advance. We've identified 3 different use cases. The first one is demand-driven congestions. Demand-driven congestion would create a need for a temporary demand reduction or generation increase. Typically, this occurs when demand grows faster than forecasted. So this is tested in France, in Sweden, and in the UK. Second use case, well, similar kind of topic, but driven by an injection congestion. So typically, it occurs when the grid capacity cannot allow for additional feed-in. And this is mainly coming from, on the examples that we noted, coming from transmission grid in the Netherlands, Sweden, and Germany. And last but not least, the use case number 5, flexibility can be used for outage management. It can be a planned outage, it can be a maintenance or emergency supply. And flexibility would allow to reduce the duration of the outage and in the end to reduce the loss load. Okay, so that's the 5 use cases that we've seen within the benchmark and where industrialized or semi-industrialized solutions have been set up by DSOs. Okay, now if we look a bit at the type of procurement approach that have been set up, a very important question is the visibility over the network. If you have visibility and you are able to integrate the need for flexibility in advance, you would go for a long-term market. So basically, you would contract for a period of 6 months up to 3 years. And in that case, you have 2 options when you are in a long-term market. Option 1 is that the flexibility would allow you to postpone an investment, and you would compare the value of the flexibility to the value of an investment. And if you have some flexibility that is economically viable, you would contract in advance with a flexibility service provider. A bit like in the reserve markets that are set up by TSOs, and you would pay a reservation fee for this capacity. So this is tested in quite a lot of countries, France, UK, Netherlands, and Sweden. The other case of long-term markets, so you are a couple of years in advance, when you do your planning session, you see that flexibility could provide a service, but you also see that there's no business case for an investment. It's not optimal. Typically, it's the case of outage management. So in that case, you would reserve flexibility. You would pre-reserve flexibility, but you would not pay any reservation fee. And when you will be close to real time, you would have your list of flexibility service providers that you have pre-identified, and you would pay them only for activation. So that's a long-term market that would secure you on your flexibility. The other approach is short-term markets. It's mainly to solve to bring benefits for operation activities. So the idea is to have flexibility. Flexibility would offer you an economical alternative to existing solutions, and that's the case in the Netherlands, in Sweden, and in Germany. There are a couple of differences between these two types of markets, long-term versus short-term. Of course, the time duration that is considered, but also the level of standardization. For short-term markets, we've noted that the products are very well standardized. The duration is standardized. Basically, it's 15 minutes for intraday market, 60 minutes for day-ahead markets. The level of a block of energy, everything is very standardized. While for long-term markets, parameters can be standardized, but what we've seen on the market that we've looked at, products are not fully standardized. Second difference that we've seen is that for short-term markets, most of the markets are managed by independent market operators. Typically, Apexpot in the NRA project in Germany, Nodes, Nord Pool in the Nordics. So that's also a difference. And last difference that is quite important is that for all the short-term markets that we've seen, the TSO is usually quite involved, and that would allow, that would facilitate value stacking. That would facilitate value stacking. Yes, let's come back to that. When the TSO is involved in short-term market, that would facilitate value stacking between the mechanisms that are set up by DSOs and the mechanisms that are set up by TSOs. Okay, now after looking at what are the rules, what are the procurement approaches that are set up, we looked at the volume of capacity that has been contracted. So flexibility for DSO is something which is quite new. However, we've seen that capacity contracted is quite high, in particularly in the UK, over 1 gigawatt last year. In Germany, it was 400 megawatts. In Sweden, almost 200 megawatts, which is quite a lot of capacity contracted for a new market and for an emerging topic. Nevertheless, we didn't have the number of hours of activation, so we don't have the activated capacity. When you look at the results, you could consider that okay, some countries are in advance compared to others. What's important to have in mind is that the amount of contracted capacity varies between countries due to a couple of reasons. The first one is the actual needs and experience of DSOs with local flexibility. Typically, in the UK, the network has been historically sized for between 1 and 2 kilowatts per residential household, while in France, due to nuclear domestic heating, the network has been sized for 3 to 4 kilowatts per household. So in the end, those two countries have the same overall goal regarding energy transition and electrification of the demand, but they don't start from the same level, and then the need for flexibility is not the same. Well, second important point is that if you are in a long-term approach and if you have visibility on your need, you will be able to contract more flexibility in advance. Third, which is obviously important, is the fee, the level of the fee that you're able to to procure flexibility. And typically in countries when you are not able to invest anymore because you've already at the maximum level of investment that you are able usually to have a higher remuneration for flexibility. Here we put one of the highest price that we've seen for UKPN. Last point is the nature of the concessions. If you are on an injection-driven concession, usually you would need more flexibility than if you are in a demand-driven concession. Okay, enough about these figures. In a short word, what are the main conclusions of this report? First is that there is no one-size-fits-all model. We've seen that the need for flexibility depends on each energy context and the ambitions in terms of energy objectives and the ambitions in terms of market organization that would be set up. Second, when we looked at the transposition of the EU directive and when we looked at the level of discussions in the different countries, we understand that we are still at the beginning of this process. Regulations are evolving, market design is ongoing, so we're still at the very beginning of the story. Third, when we look at the different use cases, and in particular when we look at the countries that have integrated flexibility in their planning activities, we've learned that only 2 countries, in France and in the UK, flexibility is used for this use case, and we consider them the most advanced ones. 4, it's an issue that we've seen in all discussions regarding market design, is the market depth and the level of competition. And clearly, when you're talking about local flexibility market, that's a very important topic. Another point is that here we were focused on market-based solution, which is pushed by the European Commission. Nevertheless, there are other ways to mobilize flexibilities. Some countries have already started things before this directive. You have variable connection agreements. You have a grid tariff with time of use tariffs. You have rule-based approach, and in the end, you would need a consistent framework to make sure that you give visibilities to market players in the different ways you would mobilize flexibilities. And last, and a very important point that is usually mentioned is that if you want to have a business case that would emerge, you have to make sure that there is no obstacle to value stacking of flexibility. Good. Okay, so that were the key messages of our benchmark. Thanks a lot, and in particular, thanks to all the DSOs that have answered to our questions during this benchmark, and thanks for NADs who are very useful on the guidance regarding methodology of this benchmark.
Well, thank you very much, Accenture, Gregory and Gregorio, for that very interesting practical benchmarking study of the on-the-ground situation that obtains in approximately 200 DSOs. Very interesting. And you laid it out helpfully with your criteria and organized the information very nicely into the clusters and use cases. So thank you very much for that. It's our great pleasure here at Euroelectric to partner with Accenture on this work. Perhaps I could just ask you a quick question about the way that digital technologies are changing all of our lives and affecting commerce and business. What do you see as the potential contribution of the digital technologies in the development of local flexibility markets?
Thank you, Fergal, for your comments and this question. It's actually a very good question. So, for us, digital is key, and this for 2 reasons. First, local flexibility is becoming available thanks to all these new digital technologies, IoT and the whole telecom infrastructure that is able to collect all those data. So with connected EVs, with smart appliances at home, smart appliances in the industrial sector, there's a new wave of flexibility that is becoming available. So that's the first reason. Second reason is that if you are a DSO and if you want to integrate flexibility in your day-to-day activity, both for planning and operations activity, you would rely on an industrialized flexibility platform, and you would need to integrate it in your control room at the end. So there is a lot of activity in this domain that was also part of our study. We've seen that there are both custom solutions developed by DSOs and some market solutions that are proposed by new players or by market operators. And we've also seen that depending on the processes that is concerned, DSOs can have different options. Typically for contractualizations, they could use an external platform, that is the case for some countries, while for activation or post-activation follow-up, they could have their own platform or also use a market platform. So there's a lot of activity, and we are at the beginning of this journey. And yes, digital and the industrialization of those platforms would be very important in the development of flexibility for DSOs.
So, Gregory, thank you very much for that very helpful comment. And it seems like technology has a big role to play in the development of these flexibility markets. And I hope that you and Gregorio will stay with us for the panel discussion a little bit later. So thank you very much for that. I move on now, if I can, to the second part of the presentation. Eurelectric has prepared a report. Eurelectric members have prepared a report on the topic of procurement of distributed flexibility. And Eurelectric is a broad house. We have members from the DSO side and from the market side, and together they've worked for over a year together to come up with this report on an integrated view of how flexibility could be organized in a partnership between the DSO side and the market side. And this morning, we're glad to welcome two of the leading authors of this report. We have Rita Mota, who's from EDP in Portugal, and she is the chair of the working group Retail Market Design, and she's here to discuss this report with us this morning, together with Carolina Videra. Carolina is in Endesa in Spain, and she is co-chair of Eurelectric's working group Regulation and Network Customers. And they will present this report to you jointly. And I think it's over to you, Carolina, to start the presentation, please.
Thank you, Fergal, and thank you everyone for joining today. In this second session, as already anticipated by Fergal, and together with my colleague Rita, we are going to present a Eurelectric report that addresses two important objectives of the clean energy package. First, the integration of renewables into the system, ensuring an effective operation of the network. And second, the creation of rules for distributed energy resources when they offer flexibility to the network. This report brings a comprehensive and also an integrated approach for the procurement of flexibility from distributed flexibility on a market-based approach. This report was agreed by experts from Eurelectric, coming from different angles, coming from the wholesale market, from the retail market, and also from the DSO side. We work in this project, as already mentioned by Fergal, for almost 1 year. And during those months, we had the opportunity to run a few meetings with external experts who presented their models and their solution to procure flexibility services in their country. You can see here in the slide the different solutions to the different use cases that we analyze. Some of them have been already presented by Accenture before. We got here Flexible Power and Piclo, both are coming from the UK. We also had the French local flexibility market by Enedis. We also got the NERA project from Germany, and also the GoPax platform from the Netherlands. And later, what we did was to present some principles, some recommendations on how we believe we should implement the procurement of distributed flexibility. The process that we established for the procurement of flexibility services is the one that you can see right now in the slide. We start with the preparatory phase on the left side, which refer basically to the identification of the DSO needs to solve or to prevent congestion. Here in this phase, we also cover the products needed by the DSOs, as well as the pre-qualification process for those units who want to provide the service. Then we move to the forecasting and the planning phase, where the DSO will have to identify the potential risk for congestion in their networks. We continue later with the market phase, where we describe here the whole tender procedures, how the bids are collected, how the bids are evaluated, and also the differences between long-term and short-term contracts. The monitoring and the activation phase is the next one in the process. And here what we analyze is the coordination between system operators for the activation of the bids from longer term up to real time. And finally, we have to do the measurement, the validation, and the settlement to validate the actual delivery of the energy. Before going to the details of the different phases, we wanted also to present you some overarching principles that are applicable to the whole process, to the overall process for the market-based procurement. Transparency is the first one, as you can see here, and is a key principle in the whole process. This principle is especially important for market parties who needs to have proper visibility of the DSO needs and the locational information to be able to respond to the DSO needs. Here, I would like to add that we should be careful here when making data transparent, especially at a low voltage level, where at least at the beginning of the market, we won't have many market participants. Therefore, we recommend here to establish some rules to avoid unwanted market behavior. Market parties don't need only this information, they don't only need the information on the flexibility needs or the locational information, but they also need information on the tendering process. They need to know which units were selected and why. With regard also to the data visibility, we recommend here that data must be visible, must be free, and with easy access. Coordination is also a principle that we describe here, and this is very relevant for system operators. We should avoid, when we create this local market, we should avoid to have double activation or activation from one system operators that dangers the other's network. Coordination here is also important, not from the system operator point of view, but it's also important to allow value stacking. This was also a point mentioned this morning by Accenture, and this is indeed a very important principle for the flexibility service providers who use their assets to provide services to multiple markets, and therefore they will have they will have access to different revenue streams. Incentives are, of course, also very relevant. These incentives are relevant for both for the DSOs and also for market parties. We should acknowledge that we won't have any efficient provision of flexibility services without an adequate remuneration scheme. And finally, we should be technology agnostic, not only when defining the product, but also when designing the market platform that we will see later on. From now on, we are going to describe the different phases for the procurement of flexibility services, starting with the preparatory phase. In this first phase, we are going to identify the flexibility needs, the product definition, and the pre-qualification process. The first thing that we have to do is for the DSOs to identify their needs for solving or for preventing a network congestion. And to do so, the DSO will have to consider several options or even a combination of options. The solution can be, for example, a reconfiguration of the network. We could also use a flexible connection agreement. We could use a traditional reinforcement, as we have been doing in the past. We could also use a network tariff. But in order to choose the most effective solution from a system point of view, not from the DSO or from the market, from the system point of view, we recommend an economic assessment methodology to be agreed at national level. This economic assessment methodology should be agreed by the DSOs in a given country and their national regulatory authorities, considering also the input from the market actors. This methodology could include, for example, value factors such as like the capital cost deferral. It could include also the network losses. It could take into account risk, direct and indirect impact. So it could include many factors, all the relevant indicators that help the DSO or assist the DSOs in their investment decision. So we have to keep in mind that the main objective of this economic assessment methodology is that this methodology will be able to compare flexibility solution against traditional grid investment like cable or substation, or it could also compare it with the DSO's own solutions, such as I mentioned before, the grid reconfiguration. So basically, this methodology will not include other solutions that are not comparable, like network tariff or connection agreement. And these methodologies will always use the solution with zero or lower marginal cost first. Later on, if the result of the methodology includes the flexibility solution, the procurement of flexibility solution as one of the chosen solution, the DSO will have to publish a tender to test the market and to check if there is enough liquidity. Because if there is no market solution available, what the DSO will have to do is to basically use another solution according to their internal assessment. In any case, we believe that it's important that the results of the tenders are always available. And finally, and since we believe that knowing examples from other countries is always useful, the EU DSO entity that, as you may know, is already operational, we give them the task to collect and to bundle best practices at European level or even wider, related to the different network assessment that we might find in different countries. And also they could collect, for example, cases where flexibility solution has been used to overcome the time needed to put a reinforcement in place. Still in the preparatory phase, and once we have identified the DSO needs, we should now define the product. Here we have considered three categories of products. We consider an energy product, we consider a capacity product, and even a combination of both, where basically the unit receive a payment for availability and a payment for the activation. The product for congestion management don't need to be fully standardized at European level because it may hamper innovation. However, we do believe that the attributes for the products may help to avoid discrimination among market parties, and also it's important in order to be aligned with the balancing and the wholesale market. Another process that is also relevant for the product is the pre-qualification. And here we have to distinguish between the product pre-qualification and the grid pre-qualification. The product pre-qualification is basically to check if the unit can technically deliver the service. For this process, what we recommend is to do this pre-qualification process in an aggregated mode, and to, once the units got qualified, to include them in a national flexibility register to be available for DSOs and for TSOs. And finally, the grid pre-qualification is different because it depends on the changes of the network operation and affects, of course, the product delivery. So for this product grid pre-qualification, when the status of the network can change over the time, implies any form of restriction on the grid connection from a unit. We believe that here in this situation there should be a financial compensation unless the unit has a connection agreement with a restriction. I pass over now to Rita.
Thank you, Carolina. So following the preparatory phase, we go to the forecasting and planning phase. And here we approach four main topics. So the first of all is that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all, which means that the most suitable time frame depends on several factors, such as the type of event to address, the alternative options available, the liquidity of the market itself, and or the level of security required by both the DSOs and market participants. For instance, structural congestions may require long-term contracts that can be procured for a time frame of several years, while more ad hoc occasional events may be solved with short-term contracts under day-ahead or intraday timeframes. But for instance, if there is not enough assets available, even the procurement for short-term energy activation products may require a complement of a capacity product to make sure that the much-needed assets will be there actually when necessary. So the second topic is the forecast itself and the link with the type of mechanisms required. Long-term products may be particularly suitable, especially in early stages of a market, to ensure firm capacity, to ensure that the required investment from market parties so that the assets are actually there and available when required. Of course, we expect a natural evolution from long-term to more short-term mechanisms as more liquidity and reliability is provided in more mature stages of the market. The third topic is the inputs required for this. The available data and the quality of such data is, of course, fundamental. Otherwise, as in any forecasting tool, it doesn't matter if the algorithm is really amazing. If the input is not good, you'll get garbage in, garbage out. So it really takes proper input from overall grid users, and in particular from flexibility service providers, as a key for success to achieve accurate forecasts on both loads and generation flows in the DSO grid. And finally, the tools themselves. New tools and procedures with intelligence layers are required for enhanced DSO forecasts, and when available, even taking advantage of potential synergies from the TSO's forecasting tools. And these tools don't come without a cost, so adequate remuneration is also needed. Moving on to the market phase, and again, 4 topics. First of all, the information exchange with neighboring system operators, either other DSOs or TSOs. One way of doing this is through the platforms, allowing for interoperability and adequate information flows so that coordination is ensured. In early market stages, it's reasonable to consider separate platforms between TSOs and DSOs for their own congestion management to test and foster and kickstart the development of these markets. But in our perspective, as the market matures, the target should be a single platform for both DSOs and TSOs to manage congestion, allowing for a single entry point in a more seamless way for market participants, with potential gains and enhanced coordination between system operators as well. And here we are just considering congestion management, so keeping balancing apart. We are not saying this is the only possible solution. There may be also situations where fully integrated congestion management and balancing may apply. However, we consider that such option would require compatible timeframes for procurement. For instance, it depends on whether the DSOs are more proactive or more reactive in balancing procurement. It also depends on locational information of the assets, which isn't usually required for balancing purposes, but it's critical for the procurement of local assets to solve local problems. And of course, it would require robust rules regarding the settlement of the two processes. So we acknowledge that under some circumstances, there are advantages in a fully integrated model, but for most member states, we believe that the best fit is a joint platform for congestion management only. Still on information exchanges, but now with the flexibility service providers. As mentioned in the previous phase, this may happen in such a variety of timeframes, from the long-term tender for capacity to the day-ahead or intraday bids for activation, or even much prior to that when the DSO announces that he intends to launch a tender. But the point here is that disregarding of the timeframe, the key messages are on transparency to attract new parties to offer their services, increasing the liquidity, and always to provide sufficient time to market participants so that they can prepare themselves to come up with the required investments and submit their offers when those are required. The third point is on the collection of bids. The market platform, the interfaces used to collect the market bids must be easy to access, easy to use, technology neutral, allow for the participation of individual or aggregated resources, and for the direct participation of the resources owner or by a service provider acting on their behalf, such as an aggregator representing a portfolio of assets that can come in all shapes and sizes. And when it comes to the evaluation and sorting of such bids, there should be clear rules on bid selection, at least at national level, and those should be publicly available. There should also be a compensation system under certain circumstances. DSOs should publish market results and regular reporting as well on local market functioning. And there should be a regulatory mechanism to prevent situations that sometimes also occur with traditional energy suppliers and may also apply to aggregators. So this means a proper framework should be in place to protect asset providers from unwanted operation by aggregators and to prevent the consumer from being activated in the flexibility market by a different aggregator. Moving to the next phase, so we have monitoring and activation. Activation bids require a close monitoring and cooperation between system operators up to real time. The activation of bids for congestion management may require counteractions to maintain the balance in the whole power system, which may be performed by the flexibility service provider itself, by the system operator performing the congestion management action, or by the TSO that also comprises balancing responsibilities. And one must make sure that the service provider is paid only for what he actually delivers, but of course for no more than what was requested. So this requires a really strong coordination to prevent double and conflicting activations and between market processes. This means that real-time monitoring in distribution grids is of major relevance, and flexibility resources register may play an important role here, as it contains the location of the resources and the market parties operating the resource and how to monitor it. Emergencies are a bit of exceptional situations that fall kind of out of scope here. But for instance, in this chapter, in emergency states, system operators may need to consider non-market-based fallback provisions predefined between relevant system operators and market participants, respective codes and operational policies. And last but not the least, we have the phase for measurement, validation, and settlement. Unlike pre-qualifications performed ex ante to assess the capability to deliver, the measurement, validation, and settlement are performed ex post, so after the delivery period based on the data collected during these periods. To be able to validate, of course, we need to rely on data that shows us what happened in reality. So we need metered data. To do so, and by principle, main meters should be the central source for measurement to guarantee the quality and also to avoid partial compensations. However, certified submeters may also be an option upon pre-approval of the contracted party and the DSO, and under certain circumstances, such as the required telemetry capabilities of the meter, or for instance, in case of multiple suppliers. The validation may be performed by the contracting system operator itself or by a third party on its behalf. But it's important to mention that the contracting system operator shall always keep the legal responsibility. Synergies and existing best practices should also be taken into account so that in countries where there are already efficient rules in place for the participation of distributed resources in certain market mechanisms, this should be recycled, reused, applied to these new flexibility use cases as well. To prevent situations of non-delivery, DSOs and TSOs are entitled and should be entitled to put in place a penalty regime that ensures the delivery of the flexibility products they have procured, though, of course, they also may be able to consider the possibility for grace factors in certain circumstances, such as an admissible error margin. And of course, to validate and settle, meter data must be compared against something that allows to really verify the delivery, that allows to distinguish changes in what would be the normal pattern if no instructions was issued. This requires baselines, so the accuracy of the baseline methodology is therefore crucial. Different methodologies can coexist, as different methodologies may be better suited to different types of assets, situations, or technologies. Still, again, the principle of transparency. The rules per methodology must be clear and defined at national level. So that's it. Long story short, these are the main insights of our work, which we hope you find useful. So thank you very much, and back to you, Fergal.
Thank you very much, Rita and Carolina, for that very interesting report, which was a practical step-by-step guide, almost a business process guide to how the DSOs and the markets will work together to establish a market for flexibility. And indeed, the overarching principles are also very useful. And the whole thing, of course, is, as we said before, an integrated view of the way that this would function between the DSO side and the market side. So thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. And of course, you both have, and Eurelectric has a lot of form in the discussion around flexibility. This year alone, producing the position paper on the network development plan, the roadmap for flexibility. Last year, the recommendations on the transposition of Article 32. The year before that, you had the TSO-DSO joint report on active system management, and before that, the DSO Association's joint report on flexibility. So this is building on quite a lot of work that's been done in the Eurelectric House over the years. So thank you again for that, Rita and Carolina. Rita, you come from the retail market, the retail market side of the house. You're chair of retail market design. Could you describe for us in a nutshell what a well-functioning flexibility procurement market looks like from your perspective, please?
Yeah, so again, this as mentioned before, also by other participants. So this is a big change in the current mindset. But I think we can all agree that flexibility will for sure play a central role in the entire power system. And the procurement of local flexibility, such as demand, should not be an exception, of course. So I think that this will represent a reliable options for DSOs to really help manage their grids, to manage congestion in a cost-efficient way. And I think that for that to work, it takes a liquid market. It takes a really well-functioning market with well-defined rules for everyone. That are really following the principles that we explained of technology neutrality and transparency and so on. So really, I think this will allow to optimize the use of the grid, especially in the context of challenging changes in pattern behaviors with electrification, with storage, RES generation coming in. So this should also allow to probably reduce the costs from investment, but also from less curtailment and redispatching from all the RES generation that we have coming in, and it's so much useful in the future to really decarbonize the economy. So I think this is a good option to ensure a stable grid operation, and probably even evolving to the optimization of the procurement between system operators at the most cost-efficient way for the entire system. So as mentioned before, we are still at the very beginning of this. We still see very few markets, and of course the UK and the French market are some very good examples of this. But yes, it takes for transparency to really try to engage also the market parties, because we cannot work with one side only. We also need the market really to come up with solutions so that the market can be liquid enough, so that the DSO feels that this is also a reliable option for them to manage the grid, and this is really a comparable option versus other existing solutions that they have at their disposal.
Rita, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. And stressing the need for the partnership and the integrated view is really important. And Carolina, can I bring you in there? And Rita just said that some of the markets are quite immature, and earlier, Gregory, in the Accenture benchmark study, showed how many markets we have across the continent. So, Carolina, to you, you represent the DSO side of the house. What needs to change to move this on?
Thank you, Fergal. So indeed, there are already some countries that the procurement of distributed energy resources are already working. So we have seen examples in the presentation from Accenture, but also the use cases that we analyze and study during the whole Eurelectric report. By the way, I guess that everyone will have the opportunity to look at more in detail in the report the different use cases that I guess is going to be published today. However, it's not the same for everyone and for every country. In other countries, these markets are not working yet because either the national regulators are still working or are still completing the transposition of the electricity directive, and therefore there are not yet a proper incentive for the DSO. Therefore, the market is not still ready, and also incentive for the market parties that indeed are also important. In other countries, we may also need to change a few things, for example, related to the traditional connection criteria to the grid, for a more flexible ones to be able to connect more renewable capacity to the grid without the need to over-invest in the grid infrastructure as we have been doing for the last year. So, for example, if we secure the firmness for big PVs, there will be significant unused connection capacity. So I believe that we should try to allocate then more capacity, more flexible capacity to be able to connect more renewables and to use all these new mechanisms that we have presented today for solving congestion. So to sum up, Fergal, so I believe that there are still a lot to be done, not only at national level, but also at a European level. And as you may know, the discussion are ongoing related to the new network code on flexibility. So I guess that we will have a lot to do in the coming months and years. So thank you very much.
That's great, Carolina. Thanks a lot. So there's another partnership there, a local partnership and a European partnership. And I hope that this report will be helpful to, as you mentioned, to the regulators as they start their work on developing the new network code. So look, thank you very much, both Carolina and Rita. And will you stay on with us now so we can launch the panel discussion? And just for everybody out there in our audience, can I remind you to join in the social media discussions on this using the hashtag flexibility and the electric decade. So please just stay with us, Carolina and Rita, while I invite the other panelists to join us. Gregorio and Gregory will come back. And we're joined by four new people. We have James Johnson, who's the CEO and co-founder of Piccolo. And Piccolo, you will see, has been mentioned in some of the use cases. We have Thomas Kuhn, who's a flexibility expert for Enedis, also one of the use cases. And Enedis is, of course, the French DSO. So welcome, Thomas. Stefan Durick is a member of the board of Smart Ends and chair of the Markets Committee. of that. And also his company is Tico Energy, and these people in Smart 10 will be the market participants who will make this work along with the DSOs. So you're very welcome, Stefan. And Louise van Rensburg. Louise is head of the DSO and whole system coordination team at Ofgem, the British regulator, and also vice chair of the CEER distribution working group. So welcome everybody to this panel. So where will I start? Louise van Rensburg, you're here from the regulatory side of the house. I'm really delighted that you're with us this morning, and some of the use cases and many of the mentions are from the country you know best. And Louise, I suppose I would ask you about the regulatory requirements in relation to flexibilities, what sort of regulatory gaps you see, or what sort of regulatory requirements that you're thinking about. And in particular, we noticed in the last number of days, the communication by the Commission on the toolbox in relation to high energy prices mentioned as one of the solutions in that, the development of a network code on flexibility. So Louise, over to you, gaps or regulatory requirements at European level or at local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Fergal, and thanks so much for inviting me here today. Obviously, as you said, I have a dual hat on, firstly as representing SEER, the sort of European regulators group, and also as Ofgem. So I guess the main thing that I need to mention is the regulation that a number of your speakers this morning have mentioned, and that's in relation to the Clean Energy Package, and particularly Article 32 of the Electricity Directive. And that really set out the clearest requirements on the use of flexibility in distribution networks. This regulation focuses on two broad aspects. First of all, on flexibility procurement, and secondly, very closely related to that is network development plans to raise flexibility awareness. The flexibility procurement aspects that are set out in the regulation are fairly specific, and they include, on one hand, the need for incentives on DSOs to procure flexibility services, but then on the other hand, how those procurement procedures should be established, namely in a transparent, non-discriminatory and market-based manner wherever it's efficient to do so. And then the second aspect was the network development plans that I mentioned. And I think this is, again, another really useful development, because these are plans that are required at least every 2 years. And the big driver for these is to give transparency to the medium and long-term flexibility services that a DSO intends to procure alongside other network planning aspects. And of course, for anyone investing in flexibility markets, that's a really, really key element. So I think those two aspects working together are a real step forward in the sort of regulatory basis. And then, as you mentioned, or as other speakers mentioned, different NRAs across Europe are embedding various rules following out from that regulation. So in terms of regulatory gaps, and just sort of keeping this at a European level, there's obviously a lot of work going on to explore where these gaps might be at European level. Some initial work has been done by various EU bodies, including yourself, to try and identify what aspects might need to be clarified. So things like data exchanges, improved coordination, better data transparency, all the sorts of things that frankly have been noted here today. But there is a real formal basis to this, and that is the electricity regulation did provide the option for new EU regulation on demand-side flexibility to be developed if it's needed. So there is work being taken forward right now, led by ACER, to investigate this in more detail with European stakeholders feeding in. So I think definitely one to watch for the future.
Thanks for that response, Louise. And actually, you stressed something interesting there, which is the sort of the continuum periodic network development plans and giving market participants a line of sight of the way that the DSO is evolving its system, and the store or the credence or the reliance that it will be beginning to place increasingly on the role of flexibility to meet their needs. So that's really interesting, because we were, as DSOs, asking the markets to tool up and invest in sort of in the necessary procedures and so forth. And that level of transparency is going to be really important. So thank you very much for stressing all of that, Louise, and sharing us the insights from Acer and so on. And Thomas, if I could turn to you, I mean, clearly one of the overarching principles set out in the Euroelectric report is that of transparency. How do you see, as an operational DSO, how do you see that issue on the ground in your company? Do you see any limits to that? Do you see any constraints to that? How are you looking at that question around transparency? Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks for the question. For Enedis, transparency is key. It's key to develop an emerging market, and we can all agree that the DSO flexibility market is still something new for almost all the stakeholders. I would define 3 levels of transparency. The first would be the methodology used to define the flexibility needs itself. It must be made public so the market players can assess what criteria are used by the DSO to compare a flexibility service and a more traditional service like a reinforcement. For that, if I take the French example, Enedis uploaded on its website, on our website, or methodology and our roadmap to integrate the flexibility within Enedis planning and operation. So we made all we could to give the information to market players to assess what we're doing. The second part, second transparency, would be about the opportunities themselves. Once we got through the methodology, we identify some flexibility opportunities. And for those, we must be open, we must be transparent, and we must publish them. And we must start tendering either add-ons or, let's say, add them to the next roster. And the third part would be the results themselves. Market players need sign-off from the DSO to better understand the market and to know why or what they missed in the first round or in the second round of the tenders. So for that, the DSO must give number of offers, the volume that we engage, all the information that it can give without endangering data privacy or the market stability. But it also means, for starters, that some information must be withheld. For instance, the price information. In case the market depth is too shallow, it might be dangerous or even counterproductive to reveal the price, because it might set the prices to this limit. And in that case, it would just reduce the collective value of using flexibility, because the DSO will pay the maximum price each time.
Thank you, Thomas, for that. Clearly, there's a principle here to publish and make available as much information as possible, but there are constraints, privacy constraints and commercial constraints, which need to be observed. Maybe I could run around with the panel now and see if there's any response to that. So perhaps even from Stefan Durig, your members are participants in these markets, or from James Johnson, you'll be a market service provider to these DSOs. Do either of you want to come in on this point about transparency and its limits?
Yes, you have mentioned SmartN and also TICO as flexibility service provider. So thanks, Fergal, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel. With regard to transparency, I think it was already mentioned, but it must be clear that it needs to go both ways. The DSOs or the system operators, they need to clearly announce system needs and congestion areas for the aggregators, so they can assess the business potential of a specific region. And timing is also very important. I mean, if this information is not available within enough time in advance, the risk exists that only the already present actors can provide the service, which in most cases are most probably the traditional generation. And another thing is maybe that to mention is the resources register. It was also mentioned before in the presentations. In principle, yes, we agree that it's a good idea to have a resource register. However, the conditions for the registration should be quite clear. And in general, we would prefer a registration at pool level instead of asset level. It's just, I mean, there might be situations where individual level registration is justified, but if you want aggregated pools, aggregators to be competitive against other actors, you have to treat them the same as these traditional generations.
Thank you very much. That's very, very helpful. Louise, perhaps anything to come back on this question of transparency? You have a huge range of experience in the regulators in regulating transparency in wholesale markets. You have REMIT, you have the GDPR, you have the Ofgem's role, the regulator's role. We're not really reinventing the wheel here, are we?
No, exactly. A very, very long history of looking at all these sorts of elements in just from different angles. You're right. Actually, I do have a slightly different opinion to what the colleague earlier has just said, and that is about the sort of price transparency. So I think we've got to remember why we're doing flexibility. We're doing flexibility so that we can have an efficient market, so that you know, if at the end of the day consumers are not paying over the odds for having a well-run system, and the reality is that there will never be a sort of sky's the limit price for flexibility as long as there's an alternative. And I think DSOs need to be honest about what that alternative price is, because I think some of the experience we've seen as the markets have developed in the UK is that when they first opened these markets with nothing to base a price on, the price offers coming in just were all over the place, significantly varied. And what generally happened is that there were no offers accepted because the alternative was so much cheaper than what was being offered there. But when they started being a bit more transparent about what the price would be to invest in some network upgrades, for example, and gave the market participants better visibility of what they were comparing against, you started getting bids that were more closely vying for that. So it is definitely a tricky balance, and you are probably going to start with bids coming up to just below that sort of maximum. But the idea is that the more we can get people into the markets, the more we can get liquidity in these markets as much as possible. Obviously, it depends on how big the area is. That's what markets do. Markets bid prices down. So actually, I think that there does need to be better visibility across the piece, and that visibility's got to include what that cost-benefit analysis is that the companies will be looking at when they take their decisions.
Yeah, look, that's really insightful, Louise. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, it's not, these markets are evolving. We're learning by doing. We're also experiential. They're a process more than an event, and that's really, really interesting. And the question also is hanging in the air as to how to encourage small players, who don't have the resources of the bigger guys, how to get them involved, and what are the sort of barriers that might exist in relation to their participation in the market. And maybe, Stefan, could I turn it back to you? You represent many of these players. What are the sort of barriers, or what are the issues that need to be tackled so as to enable the smaller participants to come in? The age-old question of, like, we spent 30 years on the supply side, here we are on the demand side. How do we get them involved?
Well, both in SmartN and in TICO, we obviously firmly believe that the active customer will be at the center of the future energy system. However, today the use of distributed flexibility is still very limited compared to the huge potential that we have. So yes, what's the reason for that? I would say first, there are some technical barriers we have to overcome, like connectivity of assets, different protocols, different standards. I mean, that's part of the daily business of a flexibility service provider. And I mean, it's a hassle, it's a big hassle, but we can mostly deal with that. The more fundamental barrier is actually market access. And that's one of the reasons why we're sitting here around the table. This is absolutely crucial. And presently, I would say the limited access to markets is the biggest barrier to bring distributed flexibility, mainly demand-side flexibility, also on board. We will talk more about market access later. So I would like to mention two other aspects that are very often overlooked and which are related to the active customer itself. The two aspects are simplicity and trust. So we have a lot of excellent companies with amazing products in the market, but as an industry, we are still too much focused on our complex technologies and the magic we can do with it. And we often forget that the end customer does not care about the technology. The end users, they care about comfort, they care about money. Sometimes they want to do something good for the environment. And I think we are still not good enough to be self-critical. We are still not good enough at explaining the benefits of demand-side flexibility, especially to a wider public. And the other aspect is trust. It's related to that. DSF is still a new and not very well-known concept in the wider public, right? And with this lack of understanding often comes suspicion or even distrust. After all, we should not forget what aggregators intend to do is controlling household appliances. They directly steer devices in people's homes without even knowing what happens, which can sound quite intruding, to be honest. So it needs trust from the customers to let aggregators do that. Cybersecurity and data privacy are also play a major role in this. And we as an industry, we should take this trust very seriously. And we can do better, and we have to do some homework as well. It's not only regulation, it's not only lack of market access, it's also this level of trust that we need for these customers to be on board.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for that. The two T's, technology and trust, and all market, this is common around all marketplaces. And you mentioned the whole question of customers offering you control of their devices and issues around cybersecurity, very, very, very complicated and interesting things. Is there anyone else on the panel who'd like to come in on these questions, either these two things, the two T's, or anything else that we've discussed so far? And I think I can already see your hand up. Thomas, please.
In the French market, aggregators using distributed assets are a well-known and well-appreciated market player. They've been around for about 15 years now. And since there is no capacity threshold for market participation in France, be it for the TSO or the DSO mechanisms, they're free to participate. And both TSO and DSO see a great value in using distributed assets to provide flexibility services. And the only question we have is the cost for aggregators. When you use small assets like residential customers, an aggregator must stack quite a number of assets. And for each, it must install a box or a device to control some of the customers. So it's more a question of how much the TSO or DSO is ready to pay for a service and how much does it cost to the aggregator. So there is a real question of the price and of the cost of distributed flexibility.
Hi, Fergal. It's James from Piccolo here. I've got a few points to add about small providers. In our experience in the UK, they are absolutely crucial to the development of DSO markets. And the reason is quite simple. One of the biggest challenges for local flexibility is the fact that it's highly localized. You need to have assets in the right location. Liquidity is a challenge. And basically, the smaller the assets are, the larger number they can be in a specific area. And therefore, we're seeing in our auctions in the UK that the kind of fastest growing area of participation is actually from even residential level assets. So I think it's once you start with this is a new kind of market. This isn't just an extension of TSO or balancing markets. It's a brand new paradigm. And I really think the residential and small scale assets are going to play a central role to this, and right from the beginning as well.
James, thank you very much. That's very, very interesting, actually. And I'm delighted to hear customers becoming engaged, because they're the ones in whose name this whole energy transition has been affected, and it's their environment and our world that is affected by all of this. And while you're there, James, could I turn you to a slightly different question? The report, as you've heard from Carolina and Rita, sets out the 5 steps for organizing a flexibility procurement by a DSO. And those steps are interactions between the DSOs and the market participants. But there's also the question about interactions with the system operators, neighboring system operators, the TSOs, and so forth. And I'm wondering, as a technology provider into this marketplace, a solutions provider, as an execution provider, where do you see the biggest problems in that whole chain of business processes, either for the DSOs, for the market participants, or for the small customers that you mentioned? Thank you.
Great question, Fergal. So I think we very much agree with the 5 steps that have been produced in the report. It aligns with how we view the world as well. I think the biggest difficulties, when you look from a flex service provider, an FSP's perspective, again, coming back to my previous point, this is a brand new market. In the UK is leading in the European scene, but everywhere else is creating these new markets. And it's not just a new journey, a new process for the regulator and the DSOs, it's a brand new journey for the FSPs as well. And what that means, and what we've seen in the UK, and we've been operating our flex market in the UK now for 3 years. We've had over 66 million euros of contracts awarded by our auctions. So we've seen quite a lot of this play out already. Now, what we've seen is beginning, new market entrants, new FSPs that either, new companies or companies that participated in transmission level services. They start off by wanting to know, is this actually going to be worth their time? They're a kind of big question mark. What does the financial reward look like? What is the effort? And if they do that assessment and think, okay, this is interesting, their first step is actually a really small scale pilot themselves. They won't go big initially. They'll start off maybe bidding into a couple of flex competitions. And depending on how that goes, then they'll make the decision to either fully commit or withdraw from the DSO market. And that journey is really important, because what you see is the concept has been mentioned, no one size fits all. It's really important to recognize there isn't one archetype of FSP, not just different types of assets under control, different business models, but different stages of where they are in this journey for DSO flex. And a key output is not just optimizing the processes and the tools for one of those players, not dumbing it down and making it too simple. So you're focusing on just the new entrants, but not making it too complex and just focusing on the more sophisticated aggregators, but providing a bunch of different avenues for participation. That is really key to in terms of the process design itself.
That's very interesting, James. Thank you for that. And maybe I'll ask the panel again here. Louise, perhaps you're hearing something here that's quite interesting in terms of creating incentives or nudging the companies that you regulate to maximize the participation or interest of the clients that they have who are making this market work. Or perhaps from you, Stefan, where do you see from your members' side the most difficult parts of the customer journey that's involved in those 5 steps? And as ultimately, Thomas, as the organizer or the person who's at the buying end of all of this, how you could make it easier for wide scale participation. So why don't I sort of invite you in that order, Louise, Stefan, and Thomas? Thank you.
So I think, Fergal, did you want me to talk about how we incentivize companies, or what we think some of the key aspects are, or both?
Yeah. Well, I was really just picking up on the comments by James, where he was mentioning the different approaches and aspects that are involved in getting more participation. And the companies that you're obviously regulating are central to organizing all of that, along with James and his company. So I just sort of thought there was something in the air there around incentive creation, and I thought maybe you'd have a comment on that.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess there's quite a multi-layered approach, I think, to incentivization. In GB, we've probably got about 5 things I could mention. So one is we obviously have a TOTEX system of remuneration for DSOs, so it allows there to be less focus on sort of building up capital expenditure. Secondly, and nothing like sort of hardening the stick, but we've also introduced a license requirement on our DSOs that says they have to procure flexibility where it's economic to do so, and they have to develop their products in coordination with the electricity system operator and other stakeholders. So there's a license obligation on them there as well. Then in our upcoming price control process, we're introducing an incentive that will additionally reward companies that do a good job on their sort of planning and operation and facilitation of markets for flexibility. And we've also set out our sort of baseline expectation that any asks for future spending have to clearly set out how they'll also be using flexibility to manage their expected future needs, and they need to pretty fully set out where they think they need some strategic investment and where they think they're going to need flexibility, and the money that they get will hinge on how well they set out those needs. And then as part of that, I guess the price control, we also have innovation funding available that can be used to trial new developments in this area, which is obviously always a useful tool in the toolbox as well. But I think finally, there's the sort of softer approach as well that is I think proved really useful, and that is a couple of years back now, we tasked our system and network operators to work together and to develop flexibility markets at distribution levels and sort of strengthen the whole system thinking. And as a result of that ask, the Energy Network Association here set up what's known as the Open Networks Project. And that's really been a good conduit to sort of focusing in on the various aspects that are needing to be coordinated and developed. And we, together with government, sit on the steering group of that project. So that allows us to sort of steer the priorities as well. And the way we've been approaching those priorities is very much picking up on some of the points that James and others have made about you've got to lower the transaction costs of taking part, because to take part in something you don't know about, well, if you know you've got to spend 30 minutes understanding it versus, 3 months, that you're going to get a lot of people falling out. So while it was really useful at the start to have different DNOs try different things, try different products, try different ways of pricing, we've got a bit of evolution, and we can now really push that standardization to make the transaction costs lower so that more people can more easily access it. And, you don't need to be a big producer with a massive big legal arm to sort of read brand new contracts every time you want to enter a different market, and aspects like that. And then alongside that, we've got a really big push on data transparency, because I think definitely in the flexibility world, data makes the world go round. So data transparency is another sort of really big ticket item that we've been talking about.
Thanks very much for that, Louise. A very, very interesting compendium of incentives on your DSOs. That's really interesting. Stefan, do you want to come in on these questions? And after that, Thomas, and just to forewarn, I'll call Accenture after that to maybe respond what they've seen in the case studies and their benchmarking study. Stefan?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Louise, for the initial input. Incentives and slight political pressure, I think we can use more of that. In the Euroelectric report, there are already some excellent recommendations. Some are already or also mentioned by Louise. So the capex to opex approach, maybe also a stronger focus on the coordination between DSOs and between DSOs and TSOs. So the problems, I think, are recognized, and the solution or some solutions are provided, yet there is no scale up apart from some pilots, which are good, but they're not enough. So I think at least one part of the explanation is still a lack of trust of DSOs in non-traditional measures. It's not in their DNA. It's not familiar. It's not trustworthy. And I'm not blaming anybody. Get me right. I think it's a normal human reaction. And in the presented report, the Euroelectric report, which again contains some excellent recommendations, there is a reference to non-market-based fallback provisions, something like this. But why would you need that if you would have trust in market-based approaches? Or even worse, if I might say so, I stumbled over the word grace factor. We don't need a grace factor as flexibility service providers. We do not need no mercy. DSF technology is working. We are beyond the trial and error phase. So what we need, or what a flexibility service provider or an aggregator needs, is market access. We need the opportunity to scale. So the platforms are not there, or they're not mature enough. And to overcome this issue of trust and scalability, we need time, because it's a change of mindset. I think Rita has mentioned that before. So we need time, but we also need regulation, and we need political pressure in order to move forward more quickly.
That's very good, Stefan. Thank you for that. The different cultures, the different backgrounds of the different participants who now need to work together to create this new environment. And Thomas, over to you. Very important questions here around incentives, and are the DSOs incentivized enough in their bottom line or by their regulators to actually engage with this fully? The French experience looks very interesting from the Accenture study earlier. So please, Thomas, could you give us your views on the incentive frameworks?
Honoré talked us into experimenting flexibility services, but it did not set a specific remuneration scheme at first. So everything we've been doing from 2017 to 2020 has been done on our orphans. So everything we've been developing, the methodology, the test, the platform, the market that we implemented, everything's been done on all fronts. And it's only recently with the flexibility uptake and the new 4-year distribution tariffs that some of the costs are covered. But we did it first because we believed that we can optimize the cost of distribution here. And it's important for a DSO to fully embark and experience flexibility, because we know that once they will have taken off, there will be savings for the whole collectivity and for the public that we are serving, and it will have a real impact on distribution tariffs. So we do need to take on flexibility, even though we're not incentivized for an array. So it's really important. But The main point is once it's taken off, it will have and we will need a support from the NRA when it comes to this green tariff, because as it's been said before, it's a great change from CapEx to OpEx, and they will need a change of the regulation in that way.
Thank you very much for that, Thomas. Thomas, indeed, regulation and market development goes hand in hand, and the incentive regimes and aligning the incentive regime with the outcome that you want is going to be very important. Thank you for that contribution. Can I go back to Accenture? I mean, you've heard a lot from the various panelists here, and you've carried out the benchmark study that you shared with us earlier. Can I go back to either Gregory or Gregory for a comment on what you've heard and how it ties back to your study? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Fergal. Yes, only one comment, because let's say I fully agree with all has been said, in particular, let's say Stefan, that put the accent around the market access. Of course, if we do not have a market, we are not here to discuss about flexibility. This is, let me say, I would say a sort of prerequisite, no? But then also, I would like also to stress a little bit on the digital aspect, if you want, and maybe a little bit less on the change management. But the digital aspect, in my opinion, is important because here we need to set up a platform. Cybersecurity is really important. Connectivity is also important. And I believe that another aspect is a little bit more technical, but at the end is key to have this flexibility market is in place, is the interoperability about the flexibility asset, which I believe is an important topic. I don't know if Gregory, because you did the study, you are the real owner of the study, so if you want to add something also according to your experience around this digital topic.
Thank you, Gregorio. What we've seen in the study is that maybe half of the DSOs are relying on, have decided to rely on an external platform to accelerate and to industrialize their process in the different steps, in the contractualization, but also in the activation or post-activation phases. And for the other DSOs, some of them are developed their own platform, which is the case for Enedis. On some part of the process in the UK, we've seen some DSOs that have also developed their own platform. And another interesting fact is that we've seen some DSOs that gathered together, also with TSOs, which is the case of GoPax in the Netherlands, to develop a fully integrated platform, DSO, TSO, which comes back to the Euroelectric report regarding one of the potential solutions. But in all cases, as you mentioned, Gregorio, interoperability will be key to make sure that the right data will be shared with the different market players. Because here we're talking of something which is really new, is that this market is ecosystem driven, and the DSO is becoming a central player in the middle of a balanced service provider, TSO, aggregator, market operators in some part of the process. So digital will be central for them.
Well, thank you very much, panelists, for sharing so generously your points of view on this important topic of flexibility, the key enabler of the energy transition. And if I can remind you all out there, please, to join the discussion on social media using the hashtag flexibility and the hashtag electric decade. And it's hard for me to do justice to such a rich discussion, but I think there are 4 points that I'd like to summarize and bring out. But first of all, to acknowledge the 2 very practical reports that were read to us from Accenture on benchmarking actual on-the-ground situation in many of the DSOs across Europe. So thank you to Accenture for that contribution. And the Euroelectric report on the principles and procedures for flexibility procurement by the DSO. So 2 excellent contributions and timely contributions by Accenture and Euroelectric. And in connection with the panel discussion, the 4 points I'd like to bring out are, first of all, points around the regulatory domain. And we've heard very much about the requirements from the regulators and the gaps that are in the regulatory compacts. And all the while, member states are transposing Article 32 of the Electricity Directive, and many of the regulators are putting in place on the ground incentives on their DSOs in relation to the procedures that they're using for procuring flexibility, but also in relation to the longer term evolution of the network development plans. So all of those activities by the regulators are most welcome indeed. The second point I would like to take out of the discussion is the partnership. And there are many players involved in making all of this work. There are the regulators that we've just discussed, but there are the market participants, there are the DSOs, and there are the service providers who will provide the execution means to both the markets and the DSOs. And we have many questions here around the different cultures that they come from, the backgrounds that they come from, the trusts that they have, and all the while trying to work together on a case-by-case basis to develop these flexibility markets. So that stresses the need for very good relationships, very good partnerships, and long-term visions being shared by all sides. The third area is in relation to the execution of all of this and the practical side. We've heard from the platform providers how they're getting on the ground in the markets. We've heard from Accenture about the potential and it's no surprise, but what digital technologies can offer to us. And we heard around the questions of connectivity and how all of this will enable people to interact and have the right information at the right time in order to participate. And then the final piece that we talked about was the markets themselves. What everybody seems to agree is that we're building these markets. We need to mainstream these markets. And there's no need to reinvent the wheels. Markets exist all over society and in the electric industry. But we discussed the questions around transparency. We discussed the limits to that, and there are different views on that. There are some views that we should err on the safe side, and there are other views that we should err a little bit more on not publishing everything, at least at this initial phase. Of course, there are privacy considerations, and there are also cybersecurity considerations. And all of this is to win the confidence of the market participants so they do the necessary investment and they'll spend their time and money and labor in terms of organizing themselves so that they can bid into this, and also that the DSOs can have the trust that and that they can participate in this so that they can believe that their network requirements, which they're on the hook to their regulators and customers, can be satisfied. Well, thank you very much, all the panelists, for that very rich and stimulating discussion on flexibility and its importance to the energy transition. Thank you, Accenture, for preparing the benchmarking report of the practical on-the-ground situation that obtains in DSOs across Europe. Thank you, Eurelectric, for a very practical and useful contribution on the business process, the step-by-step that's needed to be adopted by the DSOs and the market participants to mainstream the procurement of flexibility across Europe. And thank you, panelists, finally, for all your contributions and all your advice and all your points of view. And I'll close the session and wish everybody a safe journey back home. Thank you very much.